Okay, this is lecture number 3, and this lecture is going to discuss the American West and what we were up to here in the Gilded Age in the western part of our history here in the United States. I want you guys to realize that Western history began with Lewis and Clark at the Louisiana Purchase Territory of 1803, 1804. This is when we received all this new acreage. We bought the land from New Orleans, Louisiana, out to Shreveport, on up into what is now Oklahoma, out to Denver, Colorado, and northward into Alberta, Canada. This land went from Mississippi River system all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And we spent $15 million on this property. That is 3 cents an acre for this land here. And so the Louisiana Purchase is what really got it all started. And then, of course, we had the Mexican War, the War of Mexico. And this war is going to give us the Southwest. So Texas, Arizona, Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, that area comes into play during this time period. So we go from sea to shining sea by 1850. And the United States is trying to figure out how to occupy all this land. Thomas Jefferson told the American people in 1804 that the Louisiana Purchase would take over 2,000 years to occupy. We did it in less than 80. In 80 years, this land is all taken. And what really got this land going is going to be a land grant during the Civil War time period. During the war, we had thousands of families who fled the east and went westward during the war. Whenever you have war, civilians flee. They go elsewhere to live. And this is true, guys, in the American Civil War. As a matter of fact, before the war ended, the American West was discussing seceding from the Union. We could have easily had 3 or 4 countries here, guys, as a result of the Civil War. We could have the West, we could have Texas as a country, we could have had the American South and also the American North. So Mr. Lincoln's plan was to keep the Union preserved, to keep the Union together and don't let it splinter into different factions and into different groups. Well, in 1862, Congress is going to pass what is called as the Morrill Land Act. The Morrill Act is going to give Western farmers up to 160 acres of land for free. To qualify for this land, you've got to go out there, get it surveyed, get a clear title on the land, so it's your land, live there 5 years, and it's yours for free. And a lot of Americans did that. They went to Iowa, they went to Nebraska, they went to the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and they settled out here using this Land Grant Act. And what an act that was. I mean, 160 acres for free if you live there for 5 years and you farm that land. And so the Land Act is really what got the West going. Of course, the railroads were also going across the country during this same time period. So you have the railroads and the land grant that really is going to conquer the West. As a matter of fact, the United States Congress is going to give Western farmers over 600 million acres of land to call their own. They give away 600 million acres of land during this time period. Okay? They also gave the railroads over 200 million acres of land to build their railroads on. And then the mining companies will also receive over 200 million acres of land. So 1 billion acres of land was given away between 1862 and 1875. That's a lot of land here, guys, in this time period. Okay? So you have all this going on with the Land Act and the railroads. And that's what really conquered the West in this time period. As a matter of fact, our largest railroad company in the 1870s is going to be the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. Pennsylvania Railroad. And they're going to have lots of track and lots of train. They had over 20,000 employees, guys, during this time period. So you're going to see the railroads really expanding and growing here in this period of time. Now, these farmers who go out west into the frontier regions and into the Great Plains, the railroad people are going to have an issue with the Native Americans. The Native Americans are realizing that their land is shrinking. And they realize that they're doing everything they can to ruin the culture of Native America. So you got this problem also to deal with here in this time period. Hey, y'all quit. Luke, y'all quit. They're going to lay down. My rowdy children over here. Okay? So guys, what's going on here is the Indian folks realizes that their time on the Great Plains is coming to an end. And to speed up this method, President Grant is going to put Indian Affairs under the War Department. The Bureau of Indian Affairs goes under the War Department. And he's going to send 3 Civil War generals out here to be in charge of Indian Affairs. He's going to send Phil Sheridan out here. When Phil Sheridan arrived in Chicago at his post here, he told the Chicago Tribune that the more he sees of these Indian folks, the more he realizes that they're degenerate people. And he says the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Okay, that's the mindset here. You're going to have General Sherman go out here. William T. Sherman is the gentleman who tore up Georgia in the American Civil War. He said, make war on civilians and war will end very quickly. And the third gentleman they sent out here is George Armstrong Custer. So Custer, Sherman, and Sheridan are going to go to Chicago, and they are in charge of Indian Affairs during this time period. Okay, so it gives you an idea of how they're looking at Native Americans here. Well, one of the biggest issues here in the Great Plains are the buffalo herds. The railroad companies have deemed the buffalo to be a safety hazard. And so therefore, they want the buffalo removed from the Great Plains to keep trains from being derailed from buffalo stampedes and buffalo herds. And it's during this time period that the United States Army allows buffalo hunters to go out west and start to annihilate the buffalo. I want to tell you guys something. When they started in 1870, when they started annihilating the buffalo herds, we had close to 100 million head of buffalo on the Great Plains. When they got finished, we had less than 2,000 head of buffalo. The Indians said, thus go the buffalo, will go the Indian. All right? Now, guys, shooting all these buffalo is a big mistake. The buffalo herds on the Great Plains took care of the Great Plains. They trimmed the grass, they watered it, and they also fertilized it. Buffaloes did not tear up the land. Cows, goats, and sheep will tear up the land. The buffalo did not do this. They were the groomsmen of the Great Plains. They're the ones who took care of the Great Plains. And by killing off all these buffalo, and then by 1910, bringing in disc plowed tractors that are gasoline powered, and farming all this land during World War I, by 1930, we got a biohazard. The Great Plains is dying. We have killed the Great Plains. We overplowed it. We did not take care of it. And by 1931, 1932, we have what is called the Dust Bowl. All that topsoil begins to blow away from the Great Plains going across the east. It's going to be a major environmental disaster when we do that. And of course, Congress, as usual, denied it. Oh, there's no problem. There's no global warming. Same old story, guys. The same old story here. And so they let it fall apart. President Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, is going to bring cows in here, over 8 million cows, to try to conquer this problem in the Great Plains. And that does work. It'll take until 1945 for the Great Plains are rebounded. But we realize you've got to make sure the Great Plains is fertilized and watered and taken care of. And the farmers of the 1920s did not do this. And the land blew away here in this time period. Okay? Now, Andrew Jackson's plan for Indian Affairs was to send these folks to reservations, to get them out of the way. Well, folks don't realize that these Indian folks of Indian removal were more white than they were Indian. These folks were only 1/16, 1/8, 1/12 Indian. They had very little Indian ancestry. And these Indians here in Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Tennessee, these Indians were farmers. They were yeoman farmers who were artisans. What it boils down to is Andrew Jackson believed that anybody with Indian blood was an Indian, and he wanted to get rid of them. White supremacy is what led to Indian removal out of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and so forth. A horrible, horrible way to treat people. They stole their land from these folks. They were middle-class farmers. They were doing just fine on their own, and they get sent off to Oklahoma on reservations. Okay, one of the darkest parts of our history involves Indian removal during this time period. Well, Indians in the Great Plains also had troubles. In November of 1864, November the 29th, 1864, at a place called Sand Creek, and Sand Creek is up in Montana, and it's in Wyoming. And at Sand Creek, Wyoming, the militia company out of Denver goes up here and makes war against the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne have not done anything that justifies warfare. It is white supremacy wanting this land taken away from these Indian folks. These white militia company out of Denver goes up here and they slaughter over 100 Indian women and children when they assaulted that village. They annihilated. And then they took body parts off these Indian kids and off these women, put them on pikes, and marched them back into Denver. They put little kids' hands and their feet on pikes as war trophies and brought them back into Denver. And this caused a war to break out across the Great Plains. The Apaches, the Arapahoes, the Cheyenne, the Comanches all went on the war path after the Sand Creek Massacre here in 1864. Finally, a treaty comes along in 1867. It's called the Medicine Lodge Treaty. And the Apaches, the Arapahoes, the Cheyenne, the Comanches agree on peace here. And then in 1868, we have the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is going to order the Indians of the Great Plains to either go to Canada, go to Oklahoma. That's the choices they have. Go northward out of the United States or go to Oklahoma. Well, a lot of these folks decided to go to Oklahoma. Okay? Don't tell us about these Indian folks. These people have lived in the Great Plains since the Ice Age. They harvest wild rice. They harvest licorice, raspberries, saskatoon berries, various kinds of grain that they harvest. They grow corn out here. They grow a little bit of wheat out here. They hunt, they fish, they eat pheasants, they eat buffalo, they eat elk. Their diets are high in protein and low in cholesterol. You have Indian men who are 65 years old that still have their abs. They're still in pretty good shape. The native people are outliving the Europeans usually by 20 years. The Europeans were dying by age 60, 70, 65, or 60 or 55. The Indians are not dying until age 80 and 85. They're in a lot better shape than the Europeans are in because of diet. They bring these folks down to Oklahoma. And what do they feed them? Number one, they get lots of pork. Lots of pork, high in cholesterol, high in fat. They start feeding them fried bread, high in calories, high in cholesterol. Okay? They're going to feed them all kinds of various foods they're not used to eating. Okay? We call this scientific genocide. You eat a bad diet, you're genociding yourself. That's America's problem today. We're going through scientific genocide because we're eating too much fast food. When I was a kid in the 1950s, you didn't see very many people overweight. People didn't eat out. Oh, you might go out to eat out on a Sunday after church, or for a birthday party, or for a wedding anniversary, or for a wedding, but usually we ate at home. We hardly ever went out to eat. We go to somebody else's house to eat, but as far as going to a restaurant, that's not very popular during the 1940s and 1950s. In the 1960s, here comes fast food, here comes suburbia. And our mom started going to KFC and buying dinner at KFC 3 times a week, and going by McDonald's and getting hamburgers twice a week, and feeding us milkshakes and colas and all this kind of stuff. And it changed our metabolism. It changed our bodies. America started getting fat because of fast food. Quick, easy, cheap food is what made genocide happen in America. And today we have a high increase in cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth because of the diets that we're eating here. We're going through scientific genocide. We've got to go back to eating lean and clean again like we once did and get off this fast food kick. And I'll just give the rest of y'all, I'll go to Tops, give me a hamburger. You know, I'll go to Burger King, I'll go to Wendy's, I'll go to Chick-fil-A, you know, because I'm too busy to go cook something to eat. So I just go and buy it, bring it back to the house and eat. And that's what's bad for us here, guys. So scientific genocide becomes a major part of the Indian reconstruction, the Indian reservation system of this time period. We killed off the buffalo they've been eating, and we start giving them all these fried foods, all this pork, all these beans and corn, and all this other stuff here, guys, into their diet. Okay? With the new Indian policies under President Grant, we put the Indian Affairs under the War Department. They decided here, guys, that the Indian people should be removed, disposed, and reconstructed. They decided the Indian people should be removed, disposed of, and reconstructed, okay, to remake them. And that's what you guys remember about these Indian affairs of this time period. Removal took place during Andrew Jackson. Disposal took place as a genocide people on the Great Plains. And of course, reconstruction is trying to rebuild Indian society with those that are left over. And y'all remember, guys, Indian disposal since Spain arrived in 1492 has been 90% successful. 90% of the American people who are here when Columbus came are going to be genocide. 90% of them. And of course, most of that's going to come through smallpox. It's going to come through smallpox. Okay? Well, in 1875, it all comes to a head. In 1875, in the Black Hills of the Dakotas, we're going to discover gold. Now, I want you guys to remember this. The Indian people do not have churches. They do not have temples. They do not have synagogues. They do not have cathedrals. Native people worship in pristine places. The Grand Canyon, Glacier National Park, Yellowstone Park, the Ozark Mountains, Stone Mountain, Georgia, the Great Lakes, the Black Hills of the Dakotas, the Gulf Coast here along Florida. I mean, you guys go out on the beach and watch that sunset. That's like a place of worship. It's a place of great beauty. Okay, so what happens here, guys, is that here in the Black Hills of the Dakotas, in the middle of Indian religious services, their temple, we discover gold. Well, Bill Sheridan, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, will offer these folks out here $6 million for the Black Hills. Their leader is Crazy Horse. And Crazy Horse says that they will not sell it for those $6 million. Now, here's what they're thinking, guys. The Louisiana Purchase cost $15 million. This is the northern side of the Louisiana Purchase. And they figured that $6 million was a fair price for this land. Okay? And Crazy Horse said no. They come back again, and Crazy Horse tells them no. The third time they come back, Crazy Horse wants $60 million for the land. And that makes everybody mad. They send out George Armstrong Custer to put down the Sioux Indians up here in the Black Hills that's being led by Crazy Horse. On June the 25th, 1876, at a place called Little Bighorn, George Armstrong Custer goes into battle against the Sioux. Now, Mr. Armstrong has been noted as being kind of crazy, being sloppy, just doing things off the cuff of his shirt, not really planning things out. At the battle at Gettysburg, he was called reckless several times. Mr. Custer had invited a number of journalists to come with him to battle the Sioux Indians. These journalists were newspaper men from Minneapolis, St. Paul, from Kansas City, from St. Louis, and Chicago. So he has the press embedded in his army. He has close to 4,000 soldiers in his army out here, but he divides his army into half. He only carries about 1,200 men with him into Little Bighorn, not realizing that Crazy Horse had over 4,000 braves. So George Armstrong Custer got totally waylaid here, guys, at Little Bighorn. He underestimated the will of the people to fight against him. Well, Crazy Horse realized they were in trouble, and so they surrendered. And after the surrendering, Crazy Horse was murdered by his own people. They saw him as being a traitor here. And these folks, these Sioux Indians, will be led down to Oklahoma into the reservation system. All right? So Little Bighorn did not do any good for anybody here. It caused the American a defeat here, and it also caused Crazy Horse his life. And of course, it cost the Sioux Indians their freedom on the Great Plains. They are now going to Oklahoma in this time period. You know, these reporters went home and started writing all kinds of cowboy stories. They wrote stories about cowboys and Indians. And they wrote stories about Wild West women and all kinds of crazy stories. And these stories are going to be read by the children who live on the East Coast. These stories were sold for 10 cents. They were called dime novels. And these kids started reading these dime novels, and they'll tell their parents, when we grow up, we're going out west to become cowboys. And so the idea of becoming a cowboy is born here through this local literature that's written after Little Bighorn. So a new kind of culture is evolving in America out of the West. Well, you know, Mr. Grant started thinking about what's going on out here. And he decided the best way to help these Indian folks is bring in religion. Well, guys, the Spanish did all that. We had the Black Legend because of all of that. It did not work. The Indian folks had their own way of life, their own culture, and they were not interested in any of the white man's culture, especially religion. They said the white man was too bloody, that their God was too bloody. Their God was a loving God that took care of the earth, and their God was destruction. And so they didn't want to have anything to do with Christianity or the American ideologies toward religion here in this time period. Okay? So they send out missionaries out here trying to convert these Indians into Christianity. And of course, it did not work. Well, here comes a gentleman whose name is Richard Pratt, P-R-A-T-T. The year is 1778. And Mr. Pratt says, we have got to go through and kill Indian culture, starting with the children. We've got to go into reservations here in Oklahoma and other places and take the children away from their parents. Separate these kids and teach them American culture and not Indian culture. He says, we're going to kill the Indian, but save the individual. We're going to kill the Indian and save the individual. You know, I heard all this in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis, the AIDS pandemic. We had ministers like Jerry Falwell who told the American people, we're going to take homosexuals and we're going to convert them into Christianity, and most of them were Christians. And we're going to kill the homosexual, but save the person. And I thought, my God, that's the craziest thing I heard yet. But go on a little bit later. In Afghanistan, I heard people say we need to get the children out of Afghanistan, bring them to America, and Americanize these children. Steal these children and teach them American values, American culture. So you have all this thought here, guys, of how to solve a problem through kidnapping the children. Old Pratt, he goes to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And then Carlisle is an old Civil War training post. They trained soldiers at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They had lots of barracks and a mess hall, administration buildings, the whole 9 yards. And he says, we are going to take the Indian children to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and kill the Indian. Y'all know the black universities also got involved in all of this. Fisk, Morehouse, Hampton Institute, Howard College. These black universities could get federal subsidies, get federal funding if they brought Indian children to their campuses to kill the Indian and save the person. It was a way for them to make revenue to keep their schools open, since white America would not help them during this time period. So you got some interesting things happening here, guys, in 1878 here with the Carlisle School here. They also opened a school at Fort Marion and also in St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine, Florida is where the Apaches went to. They transferred them across the southern tier on boxcars on railroad trains, the same way Adolf Hitler took Jews to death camps in Germany. Boxcars. You couldn't see them. The doors were all closed. And they transported them from Phoenix all the way across Mexico and Texas into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and across northwest Florida to St. Augustine. Their leader, Geronimo, was housed in a federal prison at Fort Pickens, just south of Pensacola. Some of you guys have been to Fort Pickens. You know, after a couple of years of the Indian families being in St. Augustine, they moved them back to Mount Vernon, north of Mobile. They had a rough time. And finally, they sent them all back home. So they had about 20 years of traveling here from place to place under this system here, trying to kill the Indian and trying to save the individual. Okay? Now, here's what's crazy. These church groups, these folks behind Richard Pratt, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is also involved in it. They went into the reservations of Oklahoma and stole the children. 4-year-olds to 18-year-olds were taken from their villages, stolen from their parents. Could you imagine being a parent and having your 8-year-old kid, your 12-year-old kid, your 10-year-old kid taken by gunpoint, put on a train to go to Carlisle, Pennsylvania? It's horrendous. It's terrible. And when these kids arrived in Carlisle, they were divided between the boys and the girls. They took these kids into barracks where they had various kinds of bathtubs and showers. And the first thing they did was strip all the kids off, all their clothes away from them. Their Indian moccasins, their leather dresses, their leather breeches, anything that was Indian on their bodies was taken away from them. They burned them. These people with all these naked children did not have background checks. So you know a lot of pedophilia was going on here in these boarding houses, in these encampments here to change these children from Indians into Americans. They took those kids and they scrubbed them with hog bristle brushes. They scrubbed their elbows, their knees, and their heels so toughly that they bled. Then they gave the children cotton underclothes. Then the kids were carried to the barber shop. The Indian boys saw their strength and their power in the length of their hair, and their hair was cut off. They got crew cuts. They had military type haircuts. The girls had their hair cut to be just above their neckline. The girls could have pigtails, they could have a ponytail, but that's all they could do with their hair. They too saw their feminine selves through their hair. So they're degraded. Both boys and the girls are degraded because of those haircuts they got. And then they dress them in wool clothing. I want to tell you something. Wool clothing itches like the devil. And sometimes you get allergic to wool and you get hives and breakouts and rashes and all kinds of problems from wearing wool clothing. But the worst thing of all, they gave the kids patent leather shoes. And oftentimes the kids' feet were not measured for the shoes, and the shoes were too small. They developed blisters, ingrown toenails. Kids had feet infections. Some kids died from blood poisoning because of ingrown toenails. It's a mess out here. It's crazy. And then these kids are put in the barracks, they're separated by ages into the barracks, and they're told the following. You cannot say anything that is Indian. No Indian language, you must speak English. When you pray at night, you got to pray to God, the Heavenly Father, and not to the great God. You cannot sing Indian songs. You cannot do any kind of Indian dances. Anything that's Indian that we see you doing, you shall have corporate punishment, which means they tied them over a barrel and they whipped them with a cane rod. They caned them. It's horrendous. And so oftentimes these white men and with these Indian boys, they can go through and beat the Indian out of them. There's lots of abuse going on here, guys, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and at Fort Marion and St. Augustine, other places where these kids were sent to have the Indian killed and the human survive. It's crazy. It's the most craziest part of our history we didn't even treat slaves this badly. Okay? But they're trying to find a way to make sure that these kids become good Americans. You know what happens? When they turn 18 years old, they're released. They're told that you are now graduated from school, that you have all the knowledge that white people have to go out and get you a good job. Well, these Indians would leave Pennsylvania and go to Ohio, go to Columbus, go to Toledo, going over to Indianapolis or over to Chicago, St. Louis, trying to find a job. How do the white folks that own these businesses see these Indian kids? I wouldn't hire him. I wouldn't hire her. They'll steal from us. You can't trust no Indian. And these kids could not find jobs. The promise that was given to them in Carlisle, Pennsylvania was totally worthless. And a lot of these kids went back home to Oklahoma. And when their parents saw them and how they were mannered and so forth, the parent says, you can't stay here with us. You're not part of us anymore. You're no longer an Indian. You got to go elsewhere. So these kids made their way to California and other places trying to make it, guys. The suicide rate for these kids, for these Indian boarding schools, is going to be 30%. 1/3 of these kids commit suicide because they could not make it in American society. Now, how crazy is that? Okay? So Indian children have it pretty badly. Remember I discussed the children of the sweatshops and the children of the factory towns and the children of the slaves of the sharecropping and how they were treated. Children in the Gilded Age had a hard time, but I'm not through with you guys yet. Over in New York City, we had over 10,000 vagrant children on the streets of New York at any given time. A lot of these kids were children of newly arrived immigrants. Now, these immigrants who came in during the 1850s and 1860s, they couldn't afford the luxury liners that were steam powered. They came across the Atlantic Ocean in sailing ships. And a lot of the parents died on that 6-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. And these kids arrived with no kind of adult supervision. They're alien children in New York City trying to make it. Well, here comes a Episcopalian minister whose name is Charles Loring Brace, B-R-A-C-E. Mr. Brace started what is called the Children's Aid Society. The Children's Aid Society. And he told wealthy New Yorkers, if you will send me 15 cents a day, I can feed the children of New York. The program was called Feed the Children. It's still around, guys. In 1855, as the railroad started really expanding out of New York City going westward, Mr. Brace realized that Western people needed children. Those people who lived in Western New York State and Ohio, Indiana, and so forth, they could use children on their farms. So he started what is called the offering trains. To take these orphan children, the children of no parents, put them on a train and transport them across the country for adoption, to get rid of them that way. On a Wednesday night, he would get some 80 kids together. He'd get 4 or 5 chaperones, and they'd go to the train station. He'd have a train car reserved just for his party. And the train would go all the way to Buffalo, or go all the way to Indianapolis, all the way to St. Louis. And these trains would arrive on a Friday morning. They would unhitch these train cars, put them on a sidetrack, so the kids could be on the train car the whole time. They had a bit of extra money, they might get a hotel overnight, but most of the time they stay in the train cars. In the St. Louis Dispatch on Friday morning or Friday afternoon would be an article. Children from New York will arrive here on Saturday morning at the downtown Opera House. You need a child in your household, go to the Opera House and adopt one. And on Saturday morning, the kids would all be dressed up and they'd be marched up to the Opera House. They'd be lined up across the stage. It looks just like a slave auction from the 1820s or 1830s. People would come in, sign in on a piece of paper, and then go to the child to go home with them. There's no background checks, there's no house checks or anything. They simply took the kids with them. And these kids hoped for the best. Do y'all know over 250,000 children out of New York alone went across the country on the offering trains? The trains ran from 1855 until 1930, the Great Depression. In 1936, President Roosevelt started what is called the Federal Writers Project. Writers went across the country to write local histories. They found 100,000 slaves who are still alive, who were born in slavery. They did the slave narratives. They also found these children off the offering trains and got their stories. One little boy says, I got it good. My new mama and daddy were in their 60s and never could have children. I'm their first child. I have my own bedroom. I got a nice bed. I got a goat and a goat cart out and outside in the barn. I got a brand new puppy. I got cats. I got a pony. Life is good for me. I am so lucky. They feed me. They love me. They clothe me. They take good care of me. Another little boy wrote in his diary, they abused me, they beat me. I'm forced to do all the menial work around the household, on the farm. I do not have a bedroom. My bedroom is under the staircase. Sounds like your old friend Harry Potter. Some kids did really good, and some kids didn't do so good. Some kids committed suicide because of the abuse they found in their adopted homes. So you guys get a chance, y'all read about the children of New York on the orphan trains. There's a book called The Orphan Train that goes into great detail about what took place here in this time period. Read about the children who go to Indian schools. Y'all can Google Carlisle Indian School and see all this stuff. And on your videos on Blackboard that I have for you in your video collection are some videos that deals with these two subjects. The native children and the children of New York, the orphan children. So guys, kids have a hard time in the Gilded Age. I want you guys to realize something. My generation, born after 1945, us baby boomers, as they call us baby boomers were the first American children who did not work as children. We raised your parents in the same way we were raised. They didn't work. And now your parents are raising you guys in an atmosphere where you don't have to worry about working as a child. And of course, now you will have your children who will carry on this same tradition. Okay? And us baby boomers, we really changed the way America operated in the 1950s and 1960s. And we all finished school in the 1970s and early 1980s, and then had your parents, you know. We passed down not having to work as children so that you have a childhood, to have time to grow and play and have adventures and all this good stuff without having to go through and plow a mule or ride on a tractor all day like my parents did in the 1930s. Okay, it's a whole different ball game here, guys, than what it was then. All right? Well, guys, in 1887, Congress is going to pass another act that deals with Native Americans. It is called the Dahl Severity Acts. That's spelled D-A-W-E-S, the Dahl Severity Acts. And what they told the Native Americans here in 1887 was to kill your culture. They told Native Americans, if you will go through and get rid of your culture and become Americans in the true sense of the word of an American, that we will give you farms to farm on, kill the reservation system, and that y'all have more freedom. But you got to get rid of your languages, your music, your dance, your religion, your foodways, your storytelling. It all has got to go. Your religion, it has all got to go away. You got to turn yourselves into a regular Americans to standardize the American people. All right, I want to tell you guys something. It's the craziest thing ever happened. In 1934, President Roosevelt overturned the Dawes Act. The only ones who knew the languages were the old folks. And the middle class, the middle-aged Indian folks and the young Indian folks didn't care about these languages. They've been totally denied to them. But the little kids wanted to learn. The little kids were the ones that their grandmas and grandpas taught the languages to, the dance, the songs, the music, the religion. And it's these children, these little kids, these 5- and 6-year-olds of the early 1930s, it's these kids who bring back Indian culture. Okay? Now, why is this important? In 1941, as we get into getting involved in World War II, we're trying to find a way to keep a secret code so that the Japanese and the Germans could not break. And the code we used was the Navajo code. These little 10-year-old kids in 1934 are being taught the code by their grandparents. They're being taught Navajo languages by their grandparents. And as these teenagers, these 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds, are the ones who formulate the American code during World War II, and nobody could break it. They could not break the Navajo codes. If we had not killed the dogs after 1934, we could have easily have lost World War II. And of course, the battle at Midway in June of 1942, we broke the Japanese code. In 1943, the British broke the German code. And the war changed for the Allies because we knew exactly what the enemies were up to because we had broken their codes. Our codes were safe. They did not break our codes. So the Dawes Act is really important here, guys, because it could have ruined us. We could have lost World War II because of it. And so these Indian folks decided they wanted their own farms. They wanted their own yeoman class farms here. And they decided to do away with their languages, their music, and so forth. Okay? In 1889, 2 years later, as these Indian folks had settled on their property, Oklahoma had lots of land left over. And President Benjamin Harrison is going to have what is called a land rush, the Oklahoma land rush. And all these folks are going to rush the land here. All these white folks come in, rush the land, and take the territory that the Indians did not want. All right? In 1901, these Native Americans in Oklahoma become United States citizens. Now, to me personally, they were citizens when Columbus arrived. But in 1901, the federal government, the Congress, is going to declare that all Native Americans are American citizens in 1901. Okay? So that's some crazy stuff going on here, guys, in the late 1800s when it comes to Native Americans and how they're treated and how they live during this time period. In 1888, an Sioux Indian prophet by the name of Wovoka is going to have a high fever. And in this fever, the Great Father comes to see him. And the Great Father in 1888 tells Wovoka it is time for a major Indian roundup, a big Indian apocalypse, if you please. He told Wovoka, when you get well, to gather all the Indian folks together and y'all worship me as you had in times past. And you give allegiance to me, and I will give you what is called the ghost dance. The ghost dance is a dance where the Indians would dance, and all the Indian spirits would be reborn out of the earth. Y'all remember Ezekiel, them bones, them dry bones, the foot bones connected to the ankle bone and so forth? Ezekiel proposed this in the Bible. And here Wovoka says that all the dead Indians of the past shall be resurrected. And those bones will be flashed out with muscles and skin. And we'll have close to 100 million warriors that will annihilate the Americans and get rid of them. And this land will return to Indian land. Wovoka started preaching the ghost dance. They kind of scared the local white folks around them that they were talking about an apocalypse here. Well, guys, in December, or I should say in the early fall of 1890, Wovoka took a large number of Sioux Indians out of Oklahoma and marched them to the Black Hills of Dakotas for no other reason than to do the ghost dance to have the resurrection take place. They were gone several weeks before the United States Army realized that they had left, and the Army goes in behind them. A lot of the people in the Army and the cavalry in this time period had been veterans of the battle at Wounded Knee. So a lot of them had vendettas against these Indian folks. Well, on the 29th day of December, 1890, the Army caught up with these Sioux Indians. Their leader's name was Black Cattle. And Black Cattle told them, we better surrender, or they will kill us up here in the Black Hills. And he told the women and children to form a circle around the men. They all held hands and formed a circle around the men. The men lined themselves across the middle of this line. One line of men across the whole middle. You got like 500 people out here, guys. And here comes in the army. They had with them their Gatling guns. Black Cattle told the Indian braves that had rifles to put the rifles on your shoulders. And when you hand the rifle to the cavalryman, to make sure you hand the rifles to them butt first. And over butt first to them. One of the young Indian braves in the middle of that line did not hear real well. He was partially deaf. And when he handed the rifle to the young lieutenant, he pointed the rifle at him. And the outside line saw this. These outline of soldiers saw this. They opened fire on all these Indians with Gatling guns. Y'all know they killed some 24 of American soldiers across the way when they opened up the Gatling guns. They shot and killed over 300 Indian folks here, guys, at a place that is called Wounded Knee, South Dakota. The ones that were not mortally wounded, the ones that could survive, were carried to an Episcopalian church. The church had been decorated for Christmas. The ones who could not be moved because of their injuries froze to death on the battlefield that night. This was the last major war with Native Americans in American history. This took place in 1890. Okay? 1890, 1492, 15, 16, 17, that's 400 years, guys, that Columbus had come to America. Almost exactly 400 years later, the Indian Wars have finally come to an end. The genocide was 90%. 90% genocide here, guys, with Indian relations from the Spanish into the Americans, United States time period. Okay? So the West, guys, was called the Promised Land by Grant. The South was a lost cause. But in this Promised Land, you had genocide. People died here because of no other reason than they were Indian. In 1941, a Berlin newspaper interviewed Adolf Hitler about his solution for Jewish people. And Adolf Hitler says, I'm following the Americans. The Americans had a degenerate group of people they wanted to get rid of, and they did a darn good job doing so. If the Americans can do what they did to their Native Americans, I can do the same thing to our Jews, our gypsies, our homosexuals, our handicapped, and other perverts, as he called them, of Europe. Makes you think about it, guys, and how important this is in world history. And to know that we were the ones who actually gave the plan to Hitler. Spain gave him the idea of the genocide. You get an idea what's going on here, okay? You can't understand Adolf Hitler till you understand the Inquisitions of Spain, Napoleon Bonaparte, Andrew Jackson, Indian removal, and then this time period of trying to kill the Indian and save the individual. It's some crazy stuff here, some very crazy stuff here, okay? I want you guys to realize the key parts of the American West being developed is going to be the farming communities and the railroads. The railroads came in here, guys, by 1880, the West was crisscrossed with railroad companies. These railroad companies are going to recruit people to come and live in their towns. Every 20 miles, the railroad had to build a town. Now, why is this so? Why every 20 miles they had to build a town? Because these trains operated from steam. You had to have water. And these steam engines could usually go about 20 miles with a tank full of water. So every 20 miles, they had to stop and refuel, re-water these locomotives. And of course, they had coal stockpiles to refuel the train with coal that was burned to create the steam from the water. So every 20 miles, you're going to have a city. If you guys do a lot of flying across the country and you get a window seat and you look down, those towns are about 20 miles apart all across the country. They just lined them up here, guys, where the train goes. All right? These towns needed people to live in them. And so the railroad companies started hiring recruiters to go to Europe to bring immigrants to live on the railroad companies, on the railroad lines. Okay, these recruiters would go to Germany and to Russia and Persia. They would go all over the eastern parts of what is now Russia, trying to recruit people. They go to Armenia, go to Georgia, go to Turkey, go to Greece, go to Germany. A lot of Germans came over during this time period. You know, one of the biggest promoters was named C.B. Smith. He worked for the Santa Fe Railroad Company, and he helped over 60,000 families to cross the Atlantic Ocean, come to New York City, and make their way to the Santa Fe Railroad lines to live in those railroad towns. These railroads told these workers, you come into these towns, we'll have jobs for you. We'll have mercantile shops for you to run. We'll have food places for y'all to operate out of. There'll be bathhouses. There'll be hotels. There'll be gambling. There'll be lots of work in these railroad towns. Well, here's the problem. The railroads got the property for free. They were paid $15,000 for every mile of track they laid and $45,000 a mile for every track they laid across the mountains. And they came in here, guys, and built these railroad towns. And they charged the people to purchase the land that they had gotten for free. They also built silos and warehouses to store your produce. If you're a farmer and you grew corn or wheat, you need a silo. The railroad town had a silo that they would rent to you. The railroads built a railroad store. They gave you credit with 30% interest. If you decide to rent a building in town to become a merchant, you had to go through and pay a high rent on that building. And part of your profits would go to the railroad company. So these railroad towns look just like sharecropping, just like mill towns. They're horrible places to go to. And all these folks in Europe were lied to. You come to America, all things are possible. The weather is great. They didn't discuss no tornadoes in Kansas. The weather is great. It's a healthy place to live. There's very little illness, and you can come and get wealthy and a heartbeat. And these folks heard that message. They were totally distraught. They were totally tired of Europe. They come to America to another trap and try to work themselves through all this stuff. Okay? So these railroad towns look just like sharecropping, just like mill towns. Okay? You also had the mining camps that came in here. Oh, they found iron ore, we found silver, we found gold. We found a big load of silver up in Carson City, Nevada. We found gold up in Butte, Montana. And these little towns that sprung up here are going to attract immigrants to come in here and try to make a living. Well, the mining camps, they had their company stores too. They charged you to rent. their buildings to sleep in, to live in. They had a company store, the whole 9 yards. Another trap. So the railroads and mining camps come in here with the farmers who have the Homestead Act trying to rebuild this territory. Okay? Sometimes these farmers didn't make it and they'd go work for the mining camps or go move to a railroad town. And here they just found another trap to get into. So the promise here, guys, was not there. Okay? And I blame all this stuff on John Wilkes Booth. I believe Mr. Lincoln would have solved the problem here. When the war comes to an end, there had been a solution to the Civil War, and all this foolishness that took place in the wealthy class would not have happened. And these railroads had a free-for-all because the Republicans, these rough Republicans, were behind the railroads. I mean, U.S. Grant was giving lobbyists money here during a Great Depression that the railroads created. And I think there should have been some changes made, okay, in this time period. There's nothing here going on here, guys, but people getting wealthy off the backs of other folks. A small number of people were getting wealthy off the backs of the other folks who lived out here, okay? Now, there's another change that takes place in the American West that's very important, and that's the American women. The American women are going to change the look of womanhood. These women came out here with their farmer husbands. These farmer husbands were 35 years old. They worked hard putting in fences, building barns, trying to purchase cattle, trying to have their cattle taken in the marketplace by these railroads who charged them extra fares for carrying the cattle to the marketplace. Charge them all this extra money to house their goods in silos and warehouses. A lot of these men died. They turned 45 years old. They had heart attacks. They had strokes. They couldn't handle the pressure of all this stuff. And when a man died, the wife had to take over. If she had teenage boys, it was not so bad. But if you had all girls, it's a whole different ball game out here. And these Western women realized that they could live a life like a man, that they could run farms and ranches, that they could operate and grow crops and have a market for their families to live off of. The women realize that they can live a life just like a man can. And it's going to change the way that women see themselves. The Western women told the East Coast women, y'all are a bunch of sissies. Y'all need to grow up and start taking over and start doing things because you have the power to do so. Don't depend on that man. Do it yourself. Pull up those bootstraps and go at it and be successful. I don't know if any of you guys in your middle school years read a book by a man by the name of Moody. The book was called Little Britches. It involved a farm family who went out west during this time period to homestead, and the father died. They had built a pretty nice sized house, and the mom decided to have a boarding house. To let people live in the boarding house with them, to charge them rent for a room. But the mama also opened a bakery and started making cakes and cookies and various treats here for the neighbors. And they survived from it. The bakery and the boarding house is what they survived off of. And that's some interesting things to look at here when it involves the American women. They realize they do not need a man to take care of them. Well, the farming families are going to come out here, that Homestead Act. We gave over 600 million acres away during this big, huge land occupation time period during the Civil War. Farm life was hard, and farm life took lots of knowledge in order to farm. And we realized that the farmers need education. We need to find a way to have the farmers through schooling. And what they did here, guys, is in 1862, with the Homestead Act, they passed the Morrill Act, the Morrill Farming Act. Okay? This act is going to start having scientific farming studies. The Morrill Act is going to create what is called A&M colleges, agricultural mechanical colleges, to teach farm boys how to farm. Your first A&M college will be Iowa State. That's your first farming college here in the country. Now we have Clemson, we got Florida A&M, we've got Georgia Tech, we got Auburn, Mississippi State, Arkansas. There's all these colleges, Texas A&M. All these colleges were designed to help teach farming to the boys here during this time period. Okay? And we're going to have what is called scientific farming. With scientific farming, you're going to study the soil and how to go through and improve the soil by using various kinds of fertilizers and chemicals. We're going to look at pollination and how to cross-pollinate crops to make bigger corn cobs, to make bigger wheat, taller wheat. We're going to learn how to go through and plant all kinds of farming, or all kinds of fruit trees and pecan trees. You know that Auburn University's got a farm, a scientific farm over in Fairhope, and all that's out there is pecan trees. They have various varieties of pecan trees that they're studying at Fairhope. University of Florida's got a station up here in Milton, and they're trying to develop a drought-resistant grass. So your lawns can stay pretty all year round because the grass can survive drought and not turn dark or turn orange or get burned by the sun. Okay? So this is all part of it, trying to find a way to produce better crop yields. Okay? They also are going to bring in what is called the Department of Agriculture. Every county will get an agent from the Department of Agriculture, and this agent will go around and help you with your farming issues. He'll go through and test your soil and tell you maybe you shouldn't plant peanuts here this year. Why don't you plant some soybeans on this acreage? And over here on this acreage, why don't you plant a little bit of cotton? Then over here on this side, plant a little bit of sugarcane. They have to go through and decide what crops are better for you to grow on your land and to rotate these crops to have better yields, to make more money as farmers. You know, the Department of Agriculture also started publishing pamphlets. And all the farmers once a month got pamphlets from the Department of Agriculture. They discussed their irrigation issues. They discussed how to go through and take care of weeds, how to go through and find better plowing techniques to use to get better yields off your crops. They did all kinds of things here. You also had your state agricultural people that also published magazines and newspapers. One of the most popular ones that I remember as a kid was called Progressive Farmer. My grandpa Weatherford, both subscribed to the Progressive Farmer. When I would go and visit them in the summertime or during Christmas time, I'd always go through and look through those magazines and read through those magazines from the Progressive Farmers. In 1965, the Progressive Farmer decided there was a lot more urban farming going on than there was rural farming. They started a magazine out of Birmingham, Alabama, to help homesteaders, to help suburbians have a better yard, to have a better fruit trees in their yards, to have better flower beds, to go and have better cooking in the homes. Progressive Farmers had recipes in. And the new magazine was called Southern Living. Southern Living was published in 1965 to help the urban farmer. The Progressive Farmer still published their magazine each month, but they also had the Southern Living that went with them. Okay? So it's interesting how this all played out, trying to help the farmers here learn how to farm better. We had the Hatch Act that took place in 1887, where they actually studied crop production, how to rotate crops, how to have better crop yields through cross-pollination. That's the Hatch Act. They also studied irrigation policies, okay? They realized, guys, that water was very important in the Great Plains. I want to tell you, you guys might not realize this. From southern Texas to the Canadian border, from Kansas City, Missouri, to Denver, Colorado, is a huge lake underground, an aquifer. That lake is 400 feet below the surface of the Great Plains. And we learned how to put water wells into this Great Lake. And by using wind power, this water could be used to irrigate the western areas of the country. Out in Nevada, we're going to build a dam, Hoover Dam, Lake Mead, and transport water from there across Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California. What killed the wicked witch of the West? Water did. Water killed that wicked witch of the West. And these farmers learned the water policies. They learned how to use the water in a better way. Okay? In 1891, here comes the Weather Bureau. The Weather Bureau is going to give farmers their local weather forecast for 4 or 5 days ahead of time. Now, guys, we do not have satellites in space. We do not have Doppler radar. We don't have anything to tell us about the weather coming. What they did was they started in Seattle, Washington, in San Francisco, and LA. It's Monday. There is rain on the horizon coming to the Pacific areas, and it'll be raining in San Francisco on Tuesday. Tuesday, it's raining in San Francisco. They sent a telegram to Salt Lake City. You're going to have rain on Wednesday. Salt Lake City telegraphs to Denver. You're going to have rain on Thursday. Denver telegraphs Kansas City. You're going to have rain on Friday. Kansas City telegraphs St. Louis. You're going to have rain on Saturday. And so your weather forecasts were done this way by using the telegraph machines. If it's raining in San Francisco, it'll be raining in Salt Lake City the next day. Then Denver, then Kansas City, then St. Louis, then Indianapolis, and then Columbus, and then Pittsburgh, and then Philadelphia, and then Washington, D.C., New York City, and Boston. And that's how the weather was done in this time period. And the Weather Bureau helped farmers with the weather. You know, in the 1930s, we started building airports. We started having airline companies that flew across the country in the 1930s. Find those old DC-3s and those old Boeing 247s. These old tail-dragger airliners that only carried about 20 people. These airports had to keep up with the weather because of the planes flying across the country. And the farmers would call the airport for the daily forecast because the airport knew when rain was coming. So you get an idea how this evolved. Now today you got the Weather Channel, you got all this Doppler radar, we have the satellites, we have the hurricane planes that fly into hurricanes, all this stuff. It's totally changed today. But guys, we learned how to farm because we started farming colleges, we started scientific farming, we had the Hatch Act to study how to grow better crops. We started the Department of Agriculture, and we started the Weather Bureau. And it's going to change everything. It's going to totally change everything. Okay? So the American farmers are very important to the conquering of the West here in the late 1800s. During World War I, these Western farmers are going to purchase gasoline-powered tractors, and they're going to supply the troops of Europe with lots of food to fight World War I. The American farmers got pretty well off, almost wealthy from World War I. The problem is they produced so much food that by 1925, food was cheap. The farmers could not make any money because food was too cheap. They produced too much food. And by 1925, the American farmers go into a Great Depression. That means that 45% of the Americans are in a Great Depression by 1925. The rest of the country will soon follow. By 1929, the whole country has slipped into a Great Depression. And it's going to be a hard one to get out of. It's going to be a mess out there when all this takes place. Okay? So y'all remember the American farmers, the American women who come out here and who pick up this pace when their husbands pass away. Okay? Another big industry, of course, is the mining companies. The mining companies came out here and they depended totally on the railroads. The railroads would build a spurred track up to the mining camp. And on the train would come all of the tools they needed to build the mining camp. The wood to go through and surefy all of the tunnels, the workers, the drills, the dynamite, anything they needed, and the mining industry came in by the railroads. And once the railroads were established, the mining camps were all put together, and they're out here bringing bauxite and gold and silver and other minerals out of the ground. The train was used to transport the goods to the foundries on the East Coast. So the West becomes like a colony to the East Coast. Okay? And so they start carrying all that raw materials here, guys, to the foundries on the East Coast here. Well, the big thing out here were the workers. They got tired of being swindled in the company stores. They got tired of low pay. And they got tired of hazardous work. They told these mining operators, they told these managers, if I'm going to carry dynamite 2 miles into a cave and then get it all set up and then light that wick that'll blow that dynamite in about 3 minutes, I want better pay. I won't pay for hazardous work. And then these miners told the owners of these mining companies, when we get hurt, we want a doctor here available. We want medical care. We don't want y'all trying to transport us to Salt Lake City for medical care when that is 10 days away. We can die on the way to Salt Lake City for medical care. We want doctors and nurses and hospitals here in these mining camps. And these miners begin your first major labor unions because they want better working conditions. They want better pay. Okay? They do not get it, they go on strike. They go on strike, the mines go empty, the mines are shut down, and the mining company owners are trying to find scabs to come in here and work around the miners who are on strike. And when these workers show up to replace the ones who are on strike, war breaks out between them. It's a mess out here. Okay? So the mines are a major operation here in the West here. And it's the workers who demanded better pay and better working conditions. Okay? Because they were in harm's way out here in this time period. All right? So don't forget about the mining camps out here. And they also had company stores, and they charged these men rent on places to live in and so forth. And of course, these miners barely made it. They were just like sharecroppers in the South. The mining company operators were the ones who were getting wealthy. The railroad owners were the ones who were getting wealthy. The landowners in the South were the ones who were getting wealthy. The owners of the industries in the East were the ones who were making all the money. The workers were substandard in pay and in benefits. They barely could make it here. All right? Now, the next big industry of the West is going to be the cowboy. It's going to be the cattle industry. From 1870 until 1888, the cattle industry was a major industry here on the Western frontier. And the center of all of this is going to be Texas. Down around Wimberley, Johnson City, Greene, New Braunfels, Fredericksburg, Austin, San Antonio, Laredo, Victoria, Corpus Christi is where all your big ranches were located. This is the hill country in the southern part of Texas. You guys ever traveled out to Austin, Texas, you'll see the old cowboy ranges. You'll see the old West as it was here in the 1880s. Okay? These guys on these large ranches would have close to 10,000 head of longhorn steers, longhorn cattle. These cows had come from Spain. These are Spanish cows that came to Texas back in the 15 and 1600s. Okay? These ranches were usually owned by a family, and sometimes a woman controlled the ranch because the husband had died. Okay? And she was head of the ranch. These ranchers had to find a way to fatten their cows. Now, if you've got 10,000 heads of cows, there's not enough room on your farm of 1,000 acres to feed all these cows. So these ranchers developed a system to take the cows and range them up toward Canada. These are called your cowboy overland trails going up to Canada here from this time period. Okay? What they did was very simple, guys. They would hire one cowboy to take care of 500 head of cattle. That cowboy was given 3 horses. If one came up lame, he had a horse he could ride. All right, and hopefully all 3 horses didn't come up lame at the same time, you'd be in trouble. Okay? You were also provided with food. They had chuck wagons, and if you have several hundred cowboys, you're going to need 4 or 5 chuck wagons. And oftentimes these chuck wagons were operated by men from China, Mexico, or African American men. A lot of these men that were African American were former slaves. They came out west to escape slavery and got jobs on these cattle ranches, going on these overland trails here, guys, to feed these cowboys. And of course, these wagons are nothing more than food trucks. That's all they are. They had bags and bags of dried beans. They had dried pork belly, which you call bacon today, on these wagons. They would hunt for food. They might kill a buffalo along the way to feed these men. They might kill an elk. They might go through and make prairie dog stew. They try to find food on the range here, guys, when the food supply got low on the chuck wagons. They also carried with them bags and bags of coffee beans. Yeah, they had a Starbucks going on here, guys, drinking that coffee on the way up to Canada to range these cows. In early April, they would leave Texas and make their way up toward Oklahoma, make their way into Colorado, on into Wyoming, and come into Alberta, Canada. You know, my brother Scott lived in Calgary. Scott carried me on the Cowboy Highway from Black Diamond down to the United States border. And that looked like John Wayne country. It looked like cowboy country down through there. Every turn we took on that road, I could just picture all these cows being herded and grazed out here in the 1880s. All right. The cowboys had to provide their own weapons, their own saddles, and their own sleeping bags. Everything else was provided for them. And they took care of 500 head of cattle. And they walked these cows. They did not rush them. They walked these cows some 1,500 miles to these grazing areas. When I left Houston, Texas on United Airlines flying to Calgary, it's a 4-hour flight. We're going 400 miles, 500 miles an hour on that airplane. You can see how long the walk was going to Canada with all these cows. All right. They get up here by the end of June, July, and August. They graze these cows. They had calves. You came back, instead of having 10,000 head of cows, you might have 20,000 head of cows. You might have 15,000 head of cows. And you walk these cows back to Kansas. Dodge City, the main place to go to. And here you sold the vast majority of older cows. Those steers were sold here. They put them in stockades. The cows were then loaded on railroad cars and sent to the butchers in Kansas City and St. Louis and Chicago, the big meat packing plants here. The cows you did not sell were also corralled and kept together until everybody's ready to go home to Texas. Now, you used to spend about 3 or 4 days in Dodge City. You stayed here, guys, because you want a little bit of time to relax, to get yourself together. And I want to tell you something. If you're a cowboy in this time period, you didn't smell so good. Your clothes stunk. Your boots were ruined. You just was a horrible looking mess when you got to Dodge City. And you got paid in lump sum. So you got about $200 on payday here for your work on this cattle ranching or endeavor, on this cattle herding adventure, and you got paid lump sum. And what you did was you headed to the mercantile store and you bought brand new clothes. You bought new underwear, new socks, new shirts, new pants, new boots, new belts, a brand new hat, maybe an overcoat for the next winter. You got yourself kind of fixed up. You had them go and tie all that stuff together in a brown paper bag. They use butcher paper. They load your clothes in there, fold it, and they rolled up that butcher paper and tied off with string. And then you would head to the Chinese bathhouse. And here for $1, you got a haircut, got your beard trimmed, or got a shave, and you soaked in the tub for about an hour till all that crud came off of it. Okay? And then you told that Chinaman to go and burn your clothes, that they were not worth taking back with you, just go and burn them. And then you got dried up and put all your new clothes on, put on some cologne, and you headed to the tavern. You headed to the saloon. You walked in here and heard all your friends who are on the cattle herd with you, and they're playing cards, but you want something to drink. You go to the bar and get you a sarsaparilla or get you another tough drink to drink, and you'd come over and start playing cards until you started losing money. And then you looked up at the bar and you saw the most beautiful woman that you have seen in a long time. Even though half her teeth were missing, she was still a beautiful woman. She's a working girl. In the 1800s, in the late 1800s, we had over 300,000 women who were involved in prostitution. Over 100,000 of these women were in the West Coast areas. And these ladies have come here trying to make a living. They work for the tavern owner, for the saloon owner, and they're sharecropping. He tells them they must have good soap and good perfume. They must have nice clothing. They have an account at the mercantile shop in which they owe lots of money, but they're trying to pay off their debts as best they can. She is totally a working girl. And this cowboy gets all excited. He gets up and walks up to her and he says, "Hey, baby, what's going on?" And she'll say, "You and me, let's go upstairs." And you go upstairs and you get undressed and everything. And 5 minutes later, the deed is done. And you have fallen asleep. While you're laying up there butt naked in that bed, she has got your boots, and all your clothes, and your overcoat, and your brand new hat, and she leaves the building. She goes down to the mercantile shop and tells them that she wants to exchange these items, that she did not want these items, and they give her cash money. And then she heads to the train station, and she catches the next train heading west, and she's gone. She has skipped out on her John, who's the owner of the tavern, and she has gotten all that cowboy's clothes. And he wakes up 30 minutes later, not knowing where in the hell he is, and he's naked. He comes downstairs wearing a bed sheet, and all of his friends are laughing at him, and he's got to go and borrow money now to go buy clothes to wear home. He had a very good life for a cowboy if you're not paying attention. Okay? 2 or 3 days after being in Dodge City, they head back home. They arrive home before the winter sets in. They arrive home in late fall. And the cows are let loose on the big range here, and they get ready for the next year's roundup. The next year's traveling up to the Great Plains to feed their cows. In 1886, we had a hard freeze across the southern states. This is when Mr. Flagler had opened his hotel in St. Augustine, and he had to move southward because of the Great Freeze. A lot of your cows died in Texas from that freeze. In 1887, another hard freeze comes, and it kills more cows. And the cowboy industry is ended. The big, huge overland trail trips to Canada to feed these longhorn steers is going to come to an end. Farmers began to raise cows. Your farmers begin to diversify with crops of various kinds, usually wheat and corn. They'll have hogs they'll sell, and they'll also have the cows they will sell. And so the American farmers will diversify here, guys, once the big cowboy times have come to an end. Okay, another way to make money for farmers. So the cowboy industry is going to be short-lived in this time period. Okay, now we do have 3 more congressional acts that's going to change the West. The first one is called the Timber Culture Act. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 tells farmers to plant trees. We do not want to do what Europe had done by 1000 AD. They cut all the trees down. And we realize that trees are a valuable resource for the American people. We have got to have our trees. And so when you go through and cut down trees, you plant more trees. So here comes the Timber Culture Act. Then we had the New Lands National Reclamation Act. The New Lands National Reclamation Act. This is 1902. We're setting up water policies for the future. We've got to make sure the western areas have plenty of water to plant their crops and be successful. When I used to fly to Calgary from Houston, I would sit on the left-hand side of the airplane. I sit on the starboard. I sit on the port side of the airplane, and that way I could see the mountains going up to Canada. On the other side, all you saw was the Great Plains. It's ugly on that side of the plane. I want to be on the side where the mountains were. Well, when we flew across Kansas, I could look down and I could see big crop circles. We're irrigating the land out there. And it'd just be as red and dead as Dorothy. It'd like Mars out there, and there'd be a big old huge round patch of green. And this came from these water policies from this time period, trying to make sure you had enough water to grow crops out here. Then in 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt, an environmentalist, is going to start the National Forest Service. The National Forest Service is going to be looking after the forest land and particularly engaged in the fighting of forest fires. And it's in this time period that you're going to find the teddy bear and Smokey the Bear. The teddy bear came out of Mississippi. President Roosevelt had gone down to see Walker Percy down here in Greenville, Mississippi, and he wanted to go on a bear hunt. So he came over to a place called Greenwood, Mississippi, to go on a bear hunt. They didn't find very many bears. They did find a little scraggly bear that's half starved and had it tied for the president to shoot it. And he wouldn't shoot that bear. He said, that's just a pitiful bear. I ain't going to shoot that bear. And that's where the teddy bear came from. And of course, Smokey the Bear came out of the same time period to help us prevent wildfires, prevent forest fires. So you're going to have the Timber Culture Act, you'll have the New Lands National Reformation Act, and then you'll have the Forest Service. One of the biggest items out of the West at this time period is going to be Western culture. Those journalists had come out of Little Bighorn with all kinds of tales to tell. And these journalists started writing books that are about 30 pages in length, children's books, books for teenagers. And these were your Wild West stories. Across America in the 1890s, our literature becomes what is called local service, or local color stories. And it was stories about the region, about where you live. We had stories about New Orleans during this time period. We had stories about the Deep South, but we had lots of stories about the cowboys and the Indians here in this time period. And these writers got extremely wealthy from these dime novels. These Eastern kids bought these novels and they read them at night. They were into the cowboy novels of this time period. Okay, Frederick Remington goes out west. Mr. Remington is a Yale-trained art student, and he goes out west and he starts painting the Western landscape. And a lot of his paintings, along with George Catlin's paintings, are going to be on the covers of these dime novels. And of course, the kids would look at the cover and buy the book by the cover, how the cover looks. That's not changed one bit. I buy all these different wild, crazy stories these kids read at the Valpy Library, and I see them studying the cover before they choose the book to read. The more exciting the cover is, the more they want to read that book. And that's still part of it. Well, with this Western cowboy stories being told and being read across the East Coast, here comes a gentleman whose name is Joseph McCoy. After the great freezes of the late 1880s, a lot of you cowboys are unemployed. And here Joe McCoy is going to start what is called the rodeo. He brings these Western men, these Western characters, and puts them together with a rodeo. He also brings in Native Americans. He brings in African Americans. He brings in Chinese Americans, Latino Americans to be part of his rodeo that he puts on here. And what he does is he goes to towns across the country and reserves baseball stadiums for his rodeo. Most cities by the 1890s have got baseball stadiums. They'll hold several hundred or sometimes several thousand people in one of these baseball stadiums. And here he had his rodeos. And these East Coast kids in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Brooklyn and Pittsburgh and Charlotte and Raleigh and Richmond and all the Atlanta can go to the baseball field and see the rodeos, to see that live action that took place in those Western novels they had been reading. And then here comes Buffalo Bill Cody. William F. Cody is going to start the Wild West shows. He is going to bring a soap opera of cowboys to America. You know what he did, guys? He went through and hired artists. And these artists got canvas that were 40 feet tall. 40 feet tall canvas. The canvas was as long as 400 feet. And on this canvas, they painted the Western landscape. They had cactuses and mountains and big blue sky and the whole 9 yards. And they put up telephone poles behind the outfield fence in the baseball stadiums. And these poles were like 60 feet tall. And on these poles, they put pulleys, and they pulled the canvas up to the top of those baseball, or the outfield here in these baseball stadiums. And when these kids walked into the stadiums, they saw the whole West landscape in front of them. They couldn't believe it. You know, a lot of kids peed themselves, and they saw all of that stuff. And here come his big, huge programs. His most famous performance was called George Custer and His Last Stand. He brought in Sioux Indians, he brought in cavalry members, and he put on this big, huge play of Custer's Last Stand. And the kids and the adults were totally mesmerized by this production. Then he found a sharpshooter named Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley was a poor little girl from Ohio who hunted to feed her family. And she realized that she shot animals in the head that did not disrupt the meat. Local restaurant owners started hiring Annie to go through and hunt food for them to serve in their restaurants. Yes, she shot squirrels and rabbits and birds, pheasants and so forth, for these restaurant owners to feed their patrons. Well, here comes a shooting contest in her hometown. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, would put on shooting contests and give away prizes. And a bunch of people in her hometown convinced her to go and shoot in this special shooting contest. Well, girls did not shoot in shooting contests. Annie Oakley, at 15 years of age, went. Her competitor was named Frank Butler. He was from Ireland. He was one of the best sharpshooters in the country, and she beat him. She won the contest, and she beat Frank Butler. He's 21 years old. She's 15. And he falls madly in love with Annie Oakley, and they get married. And they go around the country from shooting contest to shooting contest. And while in New Orleans, Louisiana, William F. Cody is going to go to the shooting contest to see the lady he's heard about in the name of Annie Oakley. And he signs her to the Wild West show. Annie Oakley becomes the epitome of the new American woman. She's competitive against men, but yet she's still feminine. She's still a lady. She's non-threatening. She's progressive. She rides a bicycle. She's progressive. And she's well known worldwide for her talent. You all know that William F. Cody and also Joe McCoy will carry their shows to England. Queen Victoria went to the Wild West show. She went to the rodeo. Annie Oakley met Queen Victoria. They went to Germany, went to France. The crowned heads of these European countries meet these stars from America. It's totally amazing here. And so here comes the new American woman. Annie Oakley is the epitome of American womanhood. I'm going to talk more about women in the next lecture when I go through and talk about the women reformers here that are in place during the Gilded Age and what they're up to. But Annie Oakley is a good example of the new American woman of this time period. Okay? And from this Western culture comes a new study of Western society. Americans fall in love with Western culture. And of course, there's colleges in America that teach the Western culture as a class that you can take, like the University of Texas and University of Oklahoma and so forth. And you can take these courses that deals with Western culture. So it's another way to study American history. So the American West has got a real rich history. It started when Mr. Grant, President Grant, said the South's a lost cause, but the promised land is the West. And we're going westward, young man. We're going west.